The man walked through the crowd like he owned the air itself. 200 people stood outside the Apollo Theater on a warm Harlem evening in 1962, their voices blending into the hum of celebration. Politicians shook hands. Reporters scribbled notes. Musicians laughed near the stage. It was a charity event, one of those rare moments when Harlem's underworld and its public face pretended to be the same thing. And in the middle of it all stood Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't on stage. He wasn't making speeches. He was just standing there near the side entrance, hands in his pockets, his fedora tilted slightly forward. No bodyguards flanked him. No weapons were visible. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. But everyone knew who he was. The Italian mobster pushed through the crowd with purpose. His name was Vincent, a soldier in the Genovese family, trusted enough to carry messages and collect debts, arrogant enough to believe his protection extended beyond Manhattan. He had been drinking, not stumbling drunk, but enough to mistake liquid courage for real power. Vincent stopped 3 feet from Bumpy. The conversations around them didn't stop immediately. People were still laughing, still talking, but a few heads turned. A few people sensed the shift in the air, the way animals sense a storm before the sky changes. Vincent stared at Bumpy. Bumpy didn't look up. Then Vincent leaned forward and spat directly into Bumpy Johnson's face. The sound was small, almost nothing, just the wet snap of saliva hitting skin, but 200 people heard it like a gunshot. The entire crowd fell silent. Not gradually, not in waves, all at once as if someone had cut the sound from the world. Musicians mid-laugh froze. Politicians mid-sentence stopped. Even the reporters, whose job was to stay detached, felt their pens hover over their notepads, unsure whether to write or run. Bumpy stood completely still. The spit slid slowly down his cheek, catching the glow from the theater lights. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't raise a hand to wipe it away. He just stood there. Vincent smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had just won something. He looked around, making sure everyone saw, making sure they understood that he, Vincent, soldier of the Genovese family, had just humiliated the so-called king of Harlem. He turned slightly, playing to the crowd. "That's what I think of your Harlem crown," Vincent said loud enough for the front rows to hear. Still, Bumpy said nothing. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, not quickly, not threateningly, and pulled out a folded white handkerchief. He unfolded it with the same deliberate calm a man might use to check his watch. Then he wiped his face, once, twice. He folded the handkerchief again and slipped it back into his pocket. The silence pressed down harder. Bumpy finally looked at Vincent, not with anger, not with rage, just with the quiet focus of a man examining something small and temporary. When he spoke, his voice was so calm it felt like a hand around everyone's throat. "You did this in front of everyone," Bumpy said, "so everyone will see how it ends." That was all 7 words. Vincent's smile flickered for just a second, but then he forced it back louder, wider. He laughed, a sharp, barking sound meant to show he wasn't afraid. "Yeah," Vincent said. "What are you gonna do, old man? We run downtown, you run uptown, that's how it works. You think you can touch me?" Bumpy didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, moving through the crowd with the same quiet pace he'd arrived with. No hurry, no theatrics, just a man leaving. The crowd parted for him. Vincent watched him go, still grinning, still trying to hold the moment. A few of his associates clapped him on the back. One of them handed him a drink. They were all smiling, but their smiles looked like masks. Because everyone else in that crowd, the politicians, the musicians, the reporters, the hustlers, the pimps, the dealers, the cleaners, the cooks, the drivers, they all knew one thing. Vincent had just signed his own death certificate, and Bumpy Johnson had just told him exactly when it would be delivered. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson was. Not the legend, Not the myth that would grow after his death, but the man himself, the one who walked Harlem streets like they were extensions of his own living room. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in South Carolina in 1905, but Harlem made him. He arrived in the neighborhood as a boy, angry and violent, prone to explosive outbursts that earned him his nickname. People said his head would bump when he got mad, hence Bumpy, but that rage didn't make him king. Control did. By the 1930s, Bumpy had learned the most important lesson of power. Silence is louder than shouting. He stopped throwing punches in the street. He stopped making scenes. He started thinking 3 moves ahead, 5 moves ahead, 10 moves ahead. When Harlem's numbers rackets needed protection from white mobsters, Bumpy didn't fight them head-on. He made alliances. He learned their language. He sat across from men who saw him as inferior and negotiated terms that let him survive, and then thrive. By the 1940s, he was working with the Italian Mafia, particularly the Genovese and Luciano families. They controlled the flow of heroin and gambling in New York, and Bumpy controlled Harlem. It was a partnership built on mutual profit and mutual respect. But respect in that world was a currency more valuable than money. And Vincent had just devalued it in front of 200 witnesses. Bumpy didn't need bodyguards because his reputation was his protection. Everyone in Harlem knew that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Not because he would shoot you in the street, not because he would come for you himself, but because when Bumpy decided you were done, you were done. Quietly, completely, inevitably. He never rushed. He never lost his temper. He just made a decision, and then that decision became reality. That's what Vincent didn't understand. Vincent thought the spit was a message. It was, but not the one he intended. Vincent had just told Bumpy and everyone watching that he didn't believe in consequences, that he thought his Italian protection made him untouchable, that he thought Harlem was weak. Bumpy heard all of that in the sound of spit hitting skin, and he responded the only way he knew how, by proving that no one, not soldiers, not families, not alliances, was untouchable. The charity event continued, but it was broken. Musicians played, but their melodies felt off. Politicians gave speeches, but their words fell flat. Reporters took notes, but they kept glancing toward the spot where Bumpy had stood, as if his absence was louder than his presence. Vincent stayed for another hour, drinking, laughing, playing the part of a man who had just won. His associates kept him company, but their eyes kept drifting toward the exits. They knew. They had all grown up in a world where respect was currency, where insults had prices, and where debts were always collected. They knew that what Vincent had done wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. But Vincent didn't seem to care. Maybe he thought his family's name would protect him. Maybe he thought distance would save him. Maybe he genuinely believed that Bumpy Johnson's power stopped at 125th Street and that the Italians owned everything south of that invisible line. Or maybe, deep down, he knew exactly what he had done and was trying to drown the knowledge in whiskey and bravado. Either way, by the time Vincent left the Apollo Theater that night, the message had already been sent. Not by Vincent. By Bumpy. Because the people who mattered, the ones who understood how power really worked, they all saw what happened. They saw Bumpy's face when the spit landed. They saw the calm, the handkerchief, the 7 words. And they knew. Bumpy wasn't going to kill Vincent tomorrow. He wasn't going to send men to his house that night. He wasn't going to make it quick or public or dramatic. He was going to make it slow, deliberate, inevitable. And everyone was going to watch. Vincent Colatino wasn't just some random thug. He was a made man, or at least on his way to becoming one. He worked directly under Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, a capo in the Genovese crime family who controlled gambling, loan sharking, and drug trafficking across East Harlem and parts of the Bronx. Fat Tony was a smart man. He understood the value of alliances, especially with someone like Bumpy Johnson. Harlem's black underworld was profitable, and trying to control it by force would be expensive and bloody. Better to split the profits and keep the peace. But Vincent didn't think like Fat Tony. Vincent was young, mid-30s, and hungry. He saw Bumpy Johnson as a relic from an older generation. A man whose power was built on reputation rather than violence. Vincent thought that reputation could be shattered with a single public act of disrespect. He was wrong. But by the time he realized it, it was too late. The morning after the Apollo Theater incident, Fat Tony received a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, almost friendly. "Tony, it's Bumpy." Fat Tony leaned back in his chair, already knowing why Bumpy was calling. "Bumpy, how are you?" "I'm well, thank you for asking. I heard there was some trouble last night." "Trouble?" Bumpy's voice was light, almost amused. "No trouble, Tony, just a misunderstanding." Fat Tony waited. He knew better than to interrupt. "Your boy Vincent," Bumpy continued. "He made a choice last night in front of a lot of people, important people." "I heard." "Good, then you know why I'm calling." There was a pause, not long, just enough for Fat Tony to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. "Bumpy, Vincent's one of mine. You know how it works, I can't just." "I'm not asking for permission, Tony." Another pause. "I'm calling as a courtesy," Bumpy said, "because we've done good business together, because I respect you. But that boy crossed a line and everyone saw it. If I let it go, I'm not a king anymore. I'm a joke. You understand that, don't you?" Fat Tony exhaled slowly. He did understand. In their world, respect was everything. If Bumpy didn't respond to Vincent's insult, every two-bit hustler and wannabe gangster in New York would see it as weakness. And weakness was blood in the water. "How do you want to handle it?" Fat Tony asked. "I'll handle it," Bumpy said. "You just make sure nobody gets in the way." "Bumpy, this isn't about you, Tony. It's not even about your family. It's about a stupid kid who thought he was bigger than he is. You let me take care of it and we go back to business as usual. You protect him and we've got a problem. A real problem." The line went quiet. Fat Tony knew Bumpy wasn't bluffing. He also knew that losing Vincent was a lot cheaper than going to war with Harlem. "All right," Fat Tony said finally, "but make it clean. I don't want this coming back on us." "It'll be clean," Bumpy said. "No one will even know you were involved." The call ended. Vincent Colatino had just been cut loose. Vincent didn't know about the phone call. He spent the next few days acting like nothing had changed. He collected debts, ran numbers, made his rounds through East Harlem and the Bronx. He told the story of the Apollo Theater a dozen times, each retelling making him braver, making Bumpy look weaker. But the people who heard the story didn't laugh. They nodded, they smiled, they played along. And then when Vincent left, they whispered. Because everyone who understood the game knew that Vincent was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. Bumpy, meanwhile, did nothing. He didn't send threats. He didn't make moves. He just went about his business, running his operations, attending meetings, walking the streets of Harlem like he always did. But the people who worked for him noticed something. Bumpy was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that came before earthquakes, before hurricanes, before the kind of violence that redefined the rules. One of Bumpy's lieutenants, a man named Junie Bayard, asked him outright, "Boss, what are we doing about the Italian?" Bumpy was sitting in the back of a barber shop on Lenox Avenue, getting a shave. He didn't open his eyes. "We're doing nothing," Bumpy said. "Nothing." "Nothing," Bumpy repeated. "We wait." "For what?" "For him to forget." Junie frowned. "Forget what?" Bumpy smiled just a little. "That he's already dead." Vincent's mistake wasn't the spit. It was what came after. For 2 weeks nothing happened. No retaliation, no threats, no violence. Vincent started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had gotten away with it. Maybe Bumpy really was too old, too cautious, too afraid of the Italians to make a move. Vincent's confidence grew. He started moving around more freely. He stopped looking over his shoulder. He went to restaurants, bars, social clubs, all the places he'd always gone, all the places he felt safe. And that's exactly what Bumpy was waiting for. Because fear is useful, but comfort is fatal. Bumpy's men had been watching Vincent since the night of the Apollo Theater. Not closely, not obviously, just enough to learn his patterns, where he ate, where he drank, where he gambled, who he saw when he was alone. Bumpy didn't need to know everything. He just needed to know one thing, when Vincent would feel safest. And that moment came on a Friday night, 3 weeks after the spit. Vincent was at a social club on Pleasant Avenue, deep in Italian East Harlem. It was a place where made men and associates gathered to drink, play cards, and talk business. It was safe, protected, untouchable. Or so Vincent thought. He stayed late that night, drinking and gambling until nearly 2 a.m. By the time he left, most of the other men had already gone home. The streets were empty, quiet. Vincent walked to his car, a black Cadillac parked half a block away. He was alone, but he wasn't worried. This was his neighborhood, his territory. He unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and reached for the ignition. That's when he felt the cold metal press against the back of his neck. "Don't turn around," a voice said. Vincent froze. The voice was calm, almost polite. "Start the car, drive where I tell you." Vincent's hands shook as he turned the key. The engine roared to life. "Who are you?" Vincent whispered. The voice didn't answer. "Where are we going?" Still no answer. Vincent drove. They drove for nearly an hour. The man in the backseat never spoke except to give directions. Left here, right there, straight ahead. Vincent's mind raced. He thought about running. He thought about crashing the car. He thought about begging. But he didn't do any of those things. Because deep down, he already knew. This was Bumpy's response. They drove out of Manhattan, through the Bronx, and into a part of Westchester County that Vincent didn't recognize. The roads got narrower. The streetlights disappeared. The houses gave way to trees. Finally, the voice said, "Stop here." Vincent pulled over onto a dirt road that led into the woods. "Turn off the engine." Vincent did. "Get out." Vincent opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. His legs felt weak. The man from the backseat stepped out too. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low. Vincent couldn't see his face. "Walk," the man said, gesturing toward the trees. Vincent walked. They moved deeper into the woods, far enough that the road disappeared behind them. Vincent's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His mind was screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing were 3 other men. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they just stood there waiting. Vincent stopped. The man behind him pushed him forward, and Vincent stumbled into the clearing. One of the 3 men stepped forward. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and cold, steady eyes. He looked at Vincent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Bumpy Johnson sends his regards." Vincent opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The older man nodded once. And then the world went dark. 5 days later, a construction crew working on a new highway extension near Yonkers made a discovery. At first, they thought it was an animal, something torn apart by coyotes or wild dogs. But then they looked closer, and they realized it wasn't an animal. It was a man. Or at least it used to be. The remains were scattered across a 50-foot radius, buried under leaves and dirt. The crew called the police, and the police called the medical examiner. It took 2 days to collect all the pieces. 37 of them. Each one had been carefully separated from the rest, dismembered with precision, not hacked apart in a frenzy, but methodically taken apart piece by piece. The medical examiner's report was clinical and cold. Subject was alive during initial dismemberment. Cause of death, combination of blood loss and shock. Time of death, approximately 72-96 hours before discovery. Evidence suggests use of professional-grade tools. No signs of struggle at the scene. Subject was likely restrained. The police ran the fingerprints. Vincent Colatino. The NYPD opened an investigation, but it went nowhere. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspects. The Genovese family didn't push for answers. They didn't demand justice. They didn't even hold a funeral. Because they understood the message. This wasn't a murder. It was a demonstration. Word of Vincent's death spread through New York's underworld like wildfire. Not because it was public, not because Bumpy bragged about it, but because everyone knew. The way Vincent died wasn't an accident. It wasn't personal rage. It was symbolic. 37 pieces. Some people said it was 1 piece for every year of Vincent's life. Others said it was 1 piece for every person who witnessed the spit at the Apollo Theater. Others said it didn't matter. What mattered was the message. And the message was clear. Disrespect Bumpy Johnson and you don't just die. You disappear piece by piece. The story became legend almost immediately. Hustlers told it to warn younger guys about crossing lines. Mobsters told it to remind their soldiers that alliances had limits. Even cops heard the story and knew better than to dig too deep. Because in a world where violence was common, where men were shot, stabbed, beaten, and drowned every week, Vincent's death stood out. Not because it was brutal, but because it was patient. Bumpy didn't act in anger. He didn't lash out. He waited. He planned. And when the moment was right, he delivered a consequence so complete that no one would ever forget it. Bumpy Johnson never spoke about Vincent Colatino. Not once. Not to his men. Not to his allies. Not to the reporters who tried to ask him about it years later. He simply went back to his life, running Harlem with the same calm authority he'd always had. But after Vincent's death, something changed. The Italians were more careful, more respectful. They didn't push into Harlem the way they used to. They didn't test boundaries. They didn't question Bumpy's decisions. Because they had seen what happened when someone did. And the people of Harlem, the hustlers, the dealers, the numbers runners, the everyday people just trying to survive, they saw it too. They saw that Bumpy didn't need to shout. He didn't need to show off. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to keep his word. You did this in front of everyone, so everyone will see how it ends. He had said it. And he had meant it. Vincent Colatino's death became a ghost story. The kind of story people told in bars and barbershops, on street corners and in prison cells. The details changed depending on who was telling it. Some said it was 40 pieces, some said 50, but the core of the story stayed the same. A man disrespected Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson made sure everyone remembered what happened next. The story served a purpose. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a warning, a reminder, a lesson in what happened when you mistook silence for weakness. Because Bumpy Johnson's power was never loud. It was quiet, controlled, inevitable. And that made it more terrifying than any gun, any army, any threat. Years later, after Bumpy died in 1968, people still told the story. It became part of his mythology, one of the many tales that turned a real man into a legend. But those who were there, who saw the spit, who knew Vincent, who understood how the underworld really worked. They knew it wasn't just a story. It was history. A single moment that defined an era. A single act of disrespect that cost a man everything. And a single response that reminded the world. Some men don't just demand respect, they are respect. And challenging that isn't bravery, it's suicide. In the months following Vincent's death, Harlem felt different. Not safer, violence was still a daily reality for many who lived there. But there was a new understanding in the air, a recognition that certain lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. Bumpy continued his operations with the same quiet efficiency. He ran the numbers. He oversaw the flow of heroin. He mediated disputes. He made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But he never had to remind anyone of his authority again. Vincent's death had done that for him. Fat Tony Salerno, true to his word, never brought up the incident. He and Bumpy continued their business relationship as if Vincent had never existed. In fact, their partnership grew stronger in the years that followed. Tony had learned what Bumpy already knew. Loyalty was valuable, but it had limits, and those limits were defined by respect. The other Italian families took note too. The Lucchese family, the Colombo family, the Bonanno family, they all heard the story, and they all made sure their soldiers understood. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy Johnson was not to be tested. It was a strange kind of peace, built not on trust or friendship but on fear, the productive kind of fear, the kind that made people think twice, measure their words, and remember that every action had a consequence. And in the criminal underworld, where chaos was the default, that kind of peace was priceless. But power, even the quiet kind, always has a price. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was his greatest weapon, but it was also his prison. He couldn't retire, he couldn't walk away, he couldn't show weakness or fatigue or doubt, because the moment he did, someone would try to take what he had built. That's the paradox of dominance. The higher you climb, the harder it becomes to rest. Every decision Bumpy made had to reinforce the image. Every response had to be calculated. Every word had to carry weight. And Vincent's death, while effective, was a reminder of something Bumpy already knew. In his world, there was no retirement plan. There was only the throne and the grave. You held power until someone took it from you, or until you were too tired to hold it anymore. Bumpy would hold it until 1968, when a heart attack finally did what bullets, betrayals, and prison sentences never could. But in 1962, standing in the aftermath of Vincent Colatino's death, Bumpy was at the height of his power, untouchable, unshakable, undeniable. And everyone in New York knew it. Vincent's death didn't just affect the underworld. It sent ripples through the entire social structure of Harlem and beyond. Reporters who had been at the Apollo Theater that night wrote about it in veiled terms, never mentioning names, never providing details, but hinting at something dark and significant that had happened. Their articles talked about tensions between communities and the delicate balance of power in New York's underworld. Politicians who had witnessed the spit suddenly became more cooperative with Bumpy's interests. They stopped pushing for crackdowns on numbers running. They looked the other way when certain shipments moved through Harlem. They understood that Bumpy's control of the neighborhood was the only thing keeping it from descending into open warfare. Even the NYPD, which had spent decades trying to arrest Bumpy, seemed to ease off, not because they respected him, but because they recognized that his version of order was better than the alternative. Because here's the thing about men like Bumpy Johnson, they don't just control crime, they control chaos. Remove them and the violence doesn't stop, it just becomes random, unpredictable, unsolvable. Bumpy's Harlem had rules, it had structure, it had a hierarchy that everyone understood. And Vincent's death reinforced every single one of those rules. What made Vincent's death so effective wasn't the violence itself. It was the inevitability. Bumpy didn't act out of anger. He didn't act out of pride. He acted out of necessity. Because in the world he inhabited, perception was reality. If people believed you were weak, you were weak. If people believed you were untouchable, you were untouchable. Vincent had tried to change that perception. He had tried to show that Bumpy was vulnerable, that his reputation was just smoke and mirrors. And Bumpy had responded by proving that his reputation was built on something much more solid than smoke. It was built on follow-through. He said Vincent would face consequences, and Vincent did. He said everyone would see, and everyone did. That's the difference between a threat and a promise. A threat is about fear. A promise is about certainty. Bumpy Johnson didn't make threats. He made promises. And he kept them. It's easy to talk about Vincent's death as if it were just a move in a game, a strategic decision, a necessary consequence. But Vincent was a human being. He had a mother who raised him, brothers who looked up to him, friends who laughed with him, a girlfriend who waited for him. And one night he made a choice, a stupid, arrogant, irreversible choice, and everything he was, everything he could have been, ended in a clearing in the woods, cut into 37 pieces, left to rot under leaves and dirt until a construction crew stumbled across his remains. That's the real cost of the underworld, not the money or the power or the respect, but the humanity. Men like Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Calatina operated in a world where human life was negotiable, where relationships were transactional, where loyalty lasted only as long as it was profitable. And when the transaction went bad, the cost was always paid in blood. Vincent's family never got his body back, not intact anyway. The funeral was closed casket. His mother didn't speak for months afterward. His brothers left New York and never came back. And Bumpy Johnson went to bed that night, probably slept just fine, and woke up the next morning to run his empire. Because that's what it took. That's what it always took. Over the years, the story of Vincent Calatino's death became inseparable from the legend of Bumpy Johnson. People told it as proof of Bumpy's ruthlessness, his intelligence, his unshakable authority. And all of that was true. But what the story often left out was the weight. The weight of being a man who couldn't afford to forgive, who couldn't afford to let anything slide, who couldn't afford to be human in the ways that other people were human. Bumpy Johnson was a king, but kings, even in the underworld, are prisoners of their own thrones. He couldn't show mercy without looking weak. He couldn't walk away without losing everything. He couldn't make a mistake without paying for it with his life. So when Vincent spat in his face, Bumpy didn't have a choice. Not really. He had to respond. He had to be brutal. He had to make sure the response was so complete, so unforgettable, that no one would ever test him again. And he did. But the cost wasn't just Vincent's life. It was another piece of Bumpy's humanity. Another reminder that in his world, power and loneliness were the same thing. Decades after Bumpy Johnson's death, people still talk about him. They make movies about him, write books about him, tell stories about him. And almost every one of those stories includes some version of the Vincent Calatino incident. Because it's the perfect encapsulation of who Bumpy was. A man who didn't need to shout to be heard, who didn't need to swing first to win, who understood that real power wasn't about violence, it was about certainty. If you crossed him, you would pay, not maybe, not probably, definitely. And that certainty made him more dangerous than any gangster with a gun and a temper. It made him a legend. But here's the thing about legends. They smooth out the rough edges. They make heroes out of killers. They turn calculated brutality into admirable strength. And while Bumpy Johnson was undeniably brilliant, undeniably powerful, undeniably significant, he was also undeniably brutal. He had men killed. He flooded Harlem with heroin. He ruled through fear as much as respect. And Vincent Colatino's death, however justified in the logic of the underworld, was still the murder of a human being. That's the complexity of men like Bumpy Johnson. They aren't heroes, but they aren't simple villains either. They're survivors in a world that doesn't allow for innocence. And their legacies are written in blood. So what really happened that night at the Apollo Theater? A man made a mistake, and another man made a promise. And the promise was kept in the only language that world understood: absolute, undeniable, unforgettable consequence. Vincent Colatino thought he was humiliating a rival. He thought he was proving a point. He thought he was showing strength. But what he actually did was give Bumpy Johnson the opportunity to teach a lesson that would echo through the underworld for generations. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And once earned, it's protected no matter the cost. Bumpy Johnson didn't kill Vincent because he was angry. He killed him because he had to. Because in a world where perception was everything, letting an insult go unanswered would have been the same as admitting defeat. And Bumpy Johnson never admitted defeat. Not to the Italians, not to the police, not to the system that tried to break him for decades. He was a king in a kingdom built on shadows and violence and fear. And kings, as Vincent learned too late, do not forgive public humiliation. They erase it, piece by piece, until all that's left is a story, a warning, a legend. Years later, an old hustler sat in a Harlem barbershop, telling the story to a young kid who thought he was tough. The kid had been talking big, talking about how he wasn't afraid of anyone, how he'd make a name for himself by taking down someone important. The old hustler listened, smiled, then told him about Vincent Colatino, about the SPAT, about the silence, about the 37 pieces. When the story was over, the kid sat there quiet. "So what's the lesson?" the kid finally asked. The old hustler leaned back, folded his hands, and looked the kid dead in the eye. "The lesson," he said, "is that there are two kinds of men in this world. Men who talk about what they're gonna do, and men who just do it. And you never ever confuse the two." The kid nodded. The old hustler smiled again. Bumpy Johnson never said he was dangerous. He just was. And the day Vincent forgot that, he stopped being a man and became a message. The barbershop fell quiet. And in that silence, the legend lived on.